Hi, my name is Dr. Carla Tapia, and I'm a Chilean mestiza. Being mestiza in South America means having both European, usually Spanish, and indigenous heritage. I was born and raised in Parral, a small town in Chile, a place that once was inhabited by indigenous Picunche people. After finishing high school, I enrolled in an English as a foreign language teaching program at Universidad del Biobío, a regional university not from my home. I am a qualified secondary teacher. After 4 years of working at school, I was awarded a Chilean government scholarship to pursue a Master of Education at Monash University in Australia. After completing this, I enrolled at Griffith University with a PhD scholarship and graduated in 2023 with a Doctor of Philosophy.
How did your teaching experiences influence your PhD research project?
For me, becoming a teacher was an inherited calling. My grandmother was also a teacher, and I believe that teachers can contribute to every child's education. By the time I was an in-service teacher, I realized the system tricks the educational community into believing in change, social mobility, rights, and participation. Yet, these promises rarely come true. The schooling system expects low-income and high-income students to achieve the same results in standardized testing when their realities are vastly different. One group has decent food and shelter, the students have their own room and can afford good medical care. These are just basic needs. Moreover, the same group can often travel, have books and cultural trips as part of their everyday lives. The other group, in contrast, cannot afford housing, cannot afford food, medical expenses, and they cannot even think about books or trips. So how are they expected to achieve the same results? I began to realize that trying to disrupt discriminatory practices in the classroom at school was insufficient. So it was difficult for me to deal with low salaries, limited professional agency, poor working conditions, and neglected schooling infrastructures. So I started participating in rallies, protests, and parades. These activities were to reclaim our space in society as teachers, women, and citizens with limited or no agency. These issues did not only affect us as teachers, but also our students. Although visible results from activism were unpredictable, I still needed to fight or resist for justice. So I gathered my courage, some signs, went out chanting with my peers, tried to ignore the social judgments, and yelled out for my rights. There was less chance of change occurring if I stayed home. These personal experiences motivated me to pursue my PhD project called Public Activism and Pedagogical Work, Teachers' Struggles for Educational Justice in Chile. This research explores the relationship between Chilean teachers' social activism and their pedagogical work towards social justice. This project aligns with my view that everyone should take responsibility for making small changes towards social justice, and lots of small changes add up to a significant change. Todos podemos contribuir con un grano de arena.
How did your activist and teaching experiences influence your choice of research methodologies?
As an activist and teacher and researcher, I chose to adopt research protocols developed and outlined by critical Australian Indigenous researchers. By choosing to engage with these methodologies, I wanted to resist the neoliberal marketization of both education and educational research. Unlike traditional research frames, Indigenous researchers see the underpinning elements of methodology, namely ontology, axiology, and epistemology, as totally interconnected. The project was conducted in Chile, so Chilean society has experienced ongoing social movements demanding social-political changes since the collapse of Pinochet dictatorship in 1990. The radical neoliberal model of education introduced in Chile under the dictatorship took on a laboratory policy format that has been fundamental for the development and transfer of neoliberal policies around the world. Neoliberal education policies include the marketization of education, high-stakes national testing, scripted pedagogy and curriculum practices, and technicist models for teacher education. These education policies, initially starting in Chile, have spread across the globe under the auspices of the global educational reform movement. Despite numerous democratically elected presidents in Chile, the consequences of the dictatorship are visible in a range of societal tensions that still exist in the country, which include a neoliberal socioeconomic model that privileges the private sector in welfare provision, resulting in highly criticized privatized pension system and segmented education and healthcare.
What emerged from your review of the literature on teacher activism?
My review of the literature revealed some general principles around the topic, including activism in compulsory schooling has become an increasing concern for investigation over the last decade. Most of the available literature was from the United States. There were only a few articles from Canada, Australia, and Europe, and even fewer from places such as Taiwan or India. Most of the research on teacher activism went from the Northern Hemisphere and discussed teacher activism in those countries. Evidence of the marginalization of Global South scholarship. Most articles reviewed did not explicitly articulate a theory of social justice.
Which concepts informed your theoretical framework?
These research projects are built upon Bernstein's concept of pedagogic device and pedagogic rights, plus Freire's concept of pedagogic love, to think with and about teacher experiences in the streets and in the classroom, and particularly how teachers exercise their rights of enhancement, inclusion, and participation to pursue social justice. I chose Bernstein work because I needed a theory that could help me understand and provide a theoretical language that enabled me to look at social justice on multiple levels. A model that could help me to explore how policies are translated into practices inside and outside schooling institutions and allow me to consider power and control relations and move between interactional and structural levels. In particular, I employed the concept of pedagogic device and pedagogic rights. The pedagogic device was formally developed with data from South America, Colombia specifically, and started as a model of production for the pedagogic discourse. The pedagogic rights model attempted to theorize conditions for democracy and described the three pedagogic rights for teachers and students: enhancement, inclusion, and participation. Although Bernstein's theory is rich, his diagram of the pedagogic device had limitations for me. These missing elements prevent the reader from seeing the whole picture, including how teachers' motivations and goals change through time and space. This limitation made me include Freire's idea of pedagogic love, extended by Antonia Darder. To explore teachers' experiences and motivations, pedagogic love is what teachers, particularly teacher activists, feel as the force of passion, triggering their activism and fueling their engine for transformation. This love is used as activist motivation or the driving force behind the political struggle.
How would you describe your standpoint in relation to your research project?
This project was also informed by a Chilean mestiza feminist standpoint, enacted to work with and not on teacher activists. This methodology was generated with 26 Chilean teacher activists recruited via snowballing sampling. I used 3 methods of data production with the participants. The primary method was photoyan, which I operationalized by holding a respectful conversation with the participants. We started the conversation with a photo they chose. Testimony was also engaged as a reflexive narrative method to develop a purposeful political consciousness.
How did you report your findings?
The findings were reported via 4 stories using the metaphor of the life cycle of an apple to portray the teachers' activist experiences working in the compulsory levels of schooling in different regions in Chile. The idea of the metaphor of the apple was born after a PhD reading group meeting. I needed to think how I saw myself within my research, and the apple idea came up. Metaphors are useful for people like me to whom English is an additional language because it provides cohesion, formality, and conciseness to the stories. It also creates a connection between the abstract and the concrete, making writing more accessible.
Can you describe the metaphor in more detail?
Apple metaphor was chosen because offers an ecological approach to understanding activist development. Secondly, apples have an established historical link to teaching practice. Finally, the choice of an apple metaphor reflects my personal response to both teaching and activism, and my relationship with other teacher activists. The metaphor considers the stages of an apple life cycle, from seed to flowering to fruiting a plant and through the generation of new seeds. This idea is used to report the cycle of an activist and to provide an impetus for the developing stories. The four stories have a relationship with common sayings or idioms about apples. For example, the apple of my eye, the apple never falls far from the tree, the forbidden fruit, and upsetting the apple cart.
What about the findings themselves? What came out of your research project?
A significant finding was that teacher activism in Chile can often be understood as an intergenerational transmission of values, beliefs, and social justice principles. The project reveals a deep commitment and emotional investment that teachers have for their profession and their students' well-being, often ignored or silenced. Teacher activists consider themselves to be important political actors with the potential to create real change, both in the classrooms and in the streets. The finding comes from the many teachers who came from families where concepts around democracy were often discussed. Some teachers' family members were also victims of the dictatorship, and even though they had been abducted or murdered, their families haven't forgotten them, meaning that despite of the state forces' efforts to finish with activists, more and more would come up if their relatives were victims. Reflecting on the popular graffiti that can be seen in different countries in South America, trataron de enterrarnos, no sabían que éramos semilla.
What is your contribution to the research field?
My contribution to theory and the field was generating a new model. My purpose is twofold in generating a new model for pedagogic rights to illustrate teachers' potential to act as pedagogic interrupters and transmitters, and enables the reader to locate teacher activism within the pedagogic device rather than external to it, and to view activism as pedagogic work rather than an additional activity. The model of pedagogic interrupters and transmitters illustrates how pedagogic interruption is a cornerstone of teaching practice, not something outside or unrelated to teaching. The model shows that activism is not only protesting in the streets, but critiquing problematic and discriminatory discourses within official curriculum discourse. I would recommend a research design based around borderland mestizaje feminism because of the advantages it enables. So the first one would be an alternative to the dominant research paradigm. This alternative research design privileged my ways of knowing, being and doing. I could challenge the traditional model of doing research on participants by doing research with them. A second one would be undertaking research with these teachers was positively received by the teacher activists. Most teacher activists reported feeling less lonely, more heard, and more valued following participation in the yarning and testimonial sessions. A third advantage would be privileging mestizas' voices. It's evident in the inclusion of mestizas and mestizo teachers in the project, and these teachers contributed to the conversation by sharing their personal concerns and experiences. Alternative methods of data production allowed the participant to express themselves and discuss the topics they considered essential. Finally, developing this project from a Chilean mestiza feminist standpoint contributed to both feminist and standpoint theories and research. After conducting this research project and absorbing all the associated articles as well as the data generated, I can suggest that mestiza feminism and mestiza standpoint are under-researched. These positions currently account for considerably less research than is available around black or white feminism or white or black standpoints. Consequently, this project provides more visibility to a marginalized group. The research contributes to ongoing discussion about teacher activism as a social movement to resist the consequences of neoliberal policies and practices in schooling, not only in Chile, but in all places where neoliberal policies have been and continue to be enacted.